All right, so it's my job to open this. My name is Thomas Newville. I with the Department of Educational Foundations. Thanks for coming, and I just want to give a frame to this and as quickly as I can, and then turn it over. And so, what I didn't plan on saying was I had this book. It was sitting next to friend Gilhool here, and I thought, oh, there must be something cool in here to say. And I look down and I see that there's this thing called the American Federation of Teachers Bill of Rights. Who knew? And it says in there something that's quite radical. It says, teachers have the right to think freely and to express themselves openly and without fear. This includes the right to hold views contrary to the majority. Who knew? I think if
Wow.
I think if that got written today, we'd be in trouble with someone. I don't know. One of the when it comes around to speaking about folks with disabilities, one of the things I consistently run into is people will say, well, what do they need? And that question drives me nuts because the answer is group-based, not human-based. So when we ask what is the human need, it's a different answer than what that unidentifiable they are. And when we start doing that, we start thinking about universal human needs or human rights, which is a big subject. When I was in Russia in June, folks who guided me about told me that I could say pretty much anything I wanted, but I was not, under any circumstances, to utter the words human rights. Was a sore subject there. And so the message that we at Millersville try to give to ourselves and to students, teachers, social workers, engineers, whoever, is that universal human need tends to rise up above other sorts of lower level things. And we're going to try to understand that by hearing stories of the panel over here, who I will tell you in a minute who they are. And I have to say that I've heard these very people tell me their stories at sessions and over dinner and over beer and so forth. And the telling of their stories is not just always interesting, but it acquires new meaning in the context of human rights. And so we want to hear with that ear. And I was thinking to myself, what's the difference? You've got individual rights, you've got civil rights, you've got human rights. And I was thinking of my friend Jean Searle here, who I'll tell you a little bit about, who is in the disability rights movement. And there was a time when disability rights was getting folks out of institutions. So it was about the marginalized individual. And although that's still relevant today, we moved on to say that civil rights are really not aimed just at the individual, but the whole group. And so disability rights became civil rights as it applies to folks with disabilities. And then, and now, we understand that really the whole disability rights movement is about human rights, because it's aimed at equitable social, cultural, economic structures as guided by the experiences of folks with disabilities. That's a whole different level. And we're going to ask our panel to speak at that level. And we're going to ask us to hear at that level. This isn't about hearing just the stories of how new laws came about or how folks got out of institutions or how we understand that process. It's about you understanding that this is about creating equitable circumstances, not just equal opportunity, equitable circumstances based on the stories that we hear of individuals. And I guess I'd say, in essence, this is a phrase that comes up a lot, which is the welfare of all of us is vested in the welfare of each of us. And so what we'll ask our panel members to do is speak from that, and we'll also ask them unreasonably to watch time so that we have 20 minutes from friend Gilhool and 20 minutes from friends Conroy and Searle, and then we'll have some time for short time for questions. And so then I just want to tell you who is sitting here so you know that we are in the presence of greatness, and I don't mean that flippantly. That I'll tell you who they are and what their roles are, but their roles are critical, but in isolation, they don't reveal who these people really are because they're extraordinary humans. Jean Searle, for example, our friend with the hat sitting there, is a woman who has been active in the disability rights movement for a very long time. She's also a co-founder and co-president of the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance. She gets invited to speak all over the state and even country. And she herself understands the experience of institutionalization because she experienced that in her life. And Jim Conroy, in front of the computer, which is apt, because Jim is president and CEO of a place called Outcome Analysis. He's the other president, the co-president of the Pennhurst Alliance. I could read you specifically the kinds of reports and data he's analyzed and such, but let me just say that the depth of what happened to folks in institutions was not known until Jim did the report. And I mean that on a national level. That when stuff gets cited, it's Jim's work that gets cited. He gathered it, he interpreted it. It's been his life work and his heart work. And Thomas Gilhool, looking very much like an attorney, is indeed an attorney. And I will say for those of us who are education majors that without Mr. Gilhool and his team of citizens, folks with disabilities wouldn't be in schools today. That the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is because of his actions. This is a man who was secretary of the Department of Education here in Pennsylvania. He was in numerous cases and argued before the Supreme Court. Was instrumental in PARC, that's the Pennsylvania ARC, and Pennhurst litigation. He was really in the middle of the Public Interest Law Center in Philadelphia, and we were wise enough here at Millersville University to award him the Millersville Presidential Medallion for Public Service, and there's a whole bunch more to know about him, but you'd rather hear them than me tell you about them. And so we'll start with Ms. Searle and Mr. Conroy for 20 minutes, then we'll have Mr. Gilhool for 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions.
Okay. I'd be glad to. It's all right with you if we reverse our order?
You do whatever you want. It's a free country.
Cool. I want to comment on two comments of Thomas. Toms tend to listen to each other with special attention. How many of you intend to, how many of you are here preparing to become great teachers? Phenomenal. Like Thomas, I was bowled over by the presence in this wonderful book from the Council of Exceptional Children way back in 1975. And the presence there of the AFT, Declaration of Rights and Responsibilities. I have been used to thinking, and we will double check the status of that declaration by the AFT, but I have been used to thinking that teaching is the only profession without a code of professional responsibility. Lawyers, architects, you name it, doctors, all have one. And I have thought that one day several graduates of this university will gather together and write one, both for the protection of teachers and for the advancement of their purposes, and I hope you may. let me just say of human rights, as Thomas did, it's all about universal human rights. That is to say, if you ask the difference between human rights and civil rights, or political rights, or economic rights, or social rights, human rights are inclusive. They reach to all. And as we will see, I hope, in this very quick walk through what's been happening over the last 4 or 5 decades, reaching effectively with enforceability and with an understanding on the part of most, if not all, members of society that every person is to be accorded human rights, inclusive rights. That concept becomes very important. I noticed just 5 days ago that the ARC of the United States, the National Association for Retarded Citizens, and before that Children, as it was known, has as their mission statement realizing human rights for all people with, as they say, intellectual/developmental disabilities. It is a phrase which Eleanor Roosevelt first promulgated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN, at the UN in 1948. Let me ask, how many of you are moviegoers? How many of you saw Lincoln? Until that movie, it was a handful of people on this campus and in the environs of Greater Lancaster, only a handful of people who knew who Thaddeus Stevens was, and a handful of people in Philadelphia, where he practiced law, often, a handful of people across the state of Pennsylvania. Now, all moviegoers at least, and even the people they talk to, know, thanks to Tommy Lee Jones, who, by the way, was a college roommate of Al Gore, thanks to Tommy Lee Jones, who played Thaddeus Stevens. Now, nearly everyone knows that he was the father of the 14th Amendment. He wrote it, and he made it happen. Indeed, he was chair of the Joint Committee to conduct the Civil War. He was in the House from Lancaster from 1859 until 1858, when he died. In fact, he was re-elected in the election after he died. What's important about that movie, Lincoln, is that you get there a sense, and I hope one night you will take the sense from the movie yourself, a great sense of the extraordinary depth and richness and resonance of Thaddeus Stevens' life and his renewal and extension of the fundamental commitment of the United States to equality. And the nice thing is that as that movie circulates the globe around the world, they will come to know Thaddeus Stevens. So compelling is his life, and so compelling is Tommy Lee Jones's performance. And so it may contribute to a concrete sense around the world of what human rights at bedrock are and why they are crucially important to a society of men and women and to individuals, all individuals everywhere. That's by way of an introduction to what you probably know very well. The founding and fundamental commitment of the United States was to equality. The movements of the 20th century, and just about a month ago and a few days, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Race Movement gathering in Washington. But the movements of people on the basis of race, as women, the movements of various excluded national groups, all of those which exploded in the middle of the 20th century and which continue to work and will again see a day of enormous expansion, I hope, at your hands within your lifetime. All of those movements were rooted in equality. The commitment of the United States, sounded in the Declaration, is, of course, familiar to you. It was written by Jefferson, not far from here. The commitment in the 14th Amendment to equality is the modern charter. And that was authored by Thaddeus Stevens. It's important, I think, to understand, as very few people do, but now with the movie many will see, and I hope realize and think about, that the experience of disability was inextricably intertwined with the commitments of the United States to equality. It is widely unknown, but if you will read Fawn Brodie's biography of Jefferson, the intimate biography, it is the book that tells us of the relationship between Sally Hemings and Jefferson. You'll remember, no you won't, 20 years ago, the book was published. All but black historians thought, oh no, that can't be. And of course, when DNA happened and Jefferson's successors, his long family, were tested, it became clear from the DNA that they had had a relationship and indeed had had several children. But what is widely unknown is, and Fawn Brodie tells us at page 51 of an intimate biography of Jefferson, is that he had a sister with retardation, a sister with, as they say now, intellectual/developmental disabilities. Fawn Brodie divines this from his daily book, where he recorded many, many things which tell us who he was at Bedrock, and among them, where he recorded the care he took for and of his sister, who died young, but after quite a full life for that day. He collected and left in his papers a poem that I think you will find of great interest about the death of a person with retardation. The 14th Amendment, as I've said, was authored by Lancaster's own Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus was born and died and lived all of his years as a person with a club foot. He was, as the movie makes plain, visibly disabled. This book, another by Fawn Brodie, who was an historian at UCLA, Thaddeus Stevens, The Scourge of the South, this book is a lovely reflection on the way in which the experience of disability formed his sense of the world and informed his judgment of what it was necessary to seek and to establish in the fundamental law and culture of the United States. It's an extraordinary book, and I highly commend it to you. Understand that the equality to which the United States was committed was no mere equality of opportunity. De Tocqueville in 1831 in Democracy in America, in his very opening paragraphs, said, "All that I have observed in the United States traces to the commitment to a fundamental equality of condition." No mere equality of opportunity, but an actual equality of condition. And to be sure that you and I had no doubt about it, the other thing that Jefferson wrote during the period of time he was doing the Declaration of Independence on the corner of 7th and Market Street in Philadelphia was a draft constitution for the state of Virginia. The first provision of the Bill of Rights in that draft constitution said 50 acres of land to every person who has none. And between the second and third draft, he struck out female person and left it straight just person. And whatever is necessary to make up 50 acres for those who already have something less than 50 acres. In another provision of his Bill of Rights, he said, no person hereafter entering Virginia shall be held in slavery. And in another provision, he said, daughters shall inherit on the same basis as sons. The phrase equality of opportunity did not arise until the era of the robber barons, not long after Lincoln. No surprise. It was a discounted equality. But it is the wider sense of equality that was intended both by Jefferson and by Thaddeus Stevens. Let me just read to you what Thaddeus Stevens had to say on June 13 of 1866, when the text of the 14th Amendment came back from the Senate to the House to be promulgated to the states. In my youth, and in my manhood, and in my old age, I had fondly dreamed that when finally any fortunate chance should have broken up the foundation of our institutions, by which he is referring to slavery and the slave trade, which Jefferson had complained about, and which provisions had been struck from the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, Jefferson in 1784 had offered a resolution in the Continental Congress providing that the states of Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, from that territory, and all of the states to come from the Northwest Territory, would forever free any person there who had been held in slavery. It lost by one vote. In any event, that is, I had fondly dreamed that when any fortunate chance should have broken up for a while the foundation of our institutions and released us from obligations the most tyrannical that ever man imposed in the name of freedom, that the intelligent, pure, and just men of this republic, true to their professions and their consciences, would have so remodeled all our institutions as to have freed them from every vestige of human oppression, of inequality of rights, of the recognized degradation of the poor and the superior caste of the rich, in short, that no distinction would be tolerated in this purified republic but what arose from merit and conduct. That was the author's understanding of the reach of the 14th Amendment. And in many ways, the history of the 20th century is, at least until its closing decades, the history of the realization of that reach of the 14th Amendment. You will remember that the 14th Amendment, in its first clause, provides for equal citizenship, and in its second, for equal protection of the law and equal and due process of law. As to equal protection of the law, as to equal citizenship, I like this definition offered in the Harvard Law Review by a professor at UCLA of equal citizenship. The principle of equal citizenship, he wrote, presumptively insists that the organized society treat each individual as a person, one who is worthy of respect, one who belongs. Stated negatively, equal citizenship presumptively forbids the organized society to treat an individual either as a member of an inferior or dependent caste or as a non-person. That's the core of equality, and that's the core of what the Supreme Court first articulated in Brown versus Board of Education, having heard an argument about whether segregated schooling should be ended for children, in which the greatest advocate of the early 20th century, representing South Carolina, had said, I do think that if the Negro child should prevail in this case, there would be no way, no reason why any state could any more segregate on the ground of age or sex, or mental deficiency. He lost the case, but he won the prediction. A few years after their success in opening the schools and requiring the appropriate education, the state-of-the-art education, the education that is possible, that works for all children with disability, the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens, it was now called, returned to the Eastern District Court of Pennsylvania, where Thaddeus Stevens had often appeared. He was the greatest lawyer of his generation in Pennsylvania, a good 40, 50 years of practice across this state. Park went back to the Eastern District of Pennsylvania to bring the Pennhurst, not to bring, someone else had brought the Pennhurst case, seeking a right to treatment, seeking treatment in the institution. Park joined that case and filed a complaint which changed the basis of the case from a right to treatment to equality. That is to say, right to treatment only exists under the Constitution because if your liberty is infringed upon, as the liberty of people in institutions was, then the society, the government has an obligation to provide compensating treatment. But that's a kind of weak read because it is based on an assumption that the liberty of people with disabilities can, let alone whimsically, can at all be infringed. And so Park pitched the Pennhurst case and the claim to community services, to integration in the community, to decent jobs, unrealized thus far, to a decent life in the community, very widely realized upon the commitment to equality. It's worth noting because so often rights conversation assumes that if a right is declared, that means it will be made real. And while it is true that the conventions of the United Nations have almost in every one among their provisions that the signing states will provide for the enforcement of all of the rights declared in the treaties, the fact is, as you might guess, that without the resources to do it, they are not rights at all. In the case of Pennhurst and community services generally, I'll skip how we got there. It's a wonderful story. The Congress, in the first year of the Reagan presidency, building on submissions from the Carter administration, amended the Medical Assistance Act of 1965 to provide for federal funds for home and community-based services for people with disability. The next section provided the same for people of age. I raise it in part because one of the important things that to be watched and to be acted upon and against or for in the next year and a half, 2 years, is whether medical assistance will survive at all, let alone whether it, as the crucial financing device for the real rights which in the United States people with disabilities have, will survive. I want to say just one other thing. In attempting to bring the Congress to ratify the treaty, which is known as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in its drafting was called the Convention on the Rights and Dignity of People with Disabilities. You may have heard a senator or a congressperson say, if we adopt this treaty, we are merely ratifying what the law of the United States now provides to all in the United States. And then they say, therefore, this treaty, some then will say, unlike the rest of the United Nations treaties, will not infringe upon our sovereignty. Well, that's true by and large. Of course, the Constitution itself says the treaties entered into by the United States and the statutes of the Congress shall be the supreme law of the land. So it binds. But by and large, the rights that it extends in the name of the world to all people with disabilities in the world are in the current law of the United States. But just as law does not become real without the resources for it to do so, so it does not become real without enforcement. And enforcement is not simply a matter of a court order or an administrative order. It is a matter of informing the people of the United States so that they see it and understand it and are themselves enthusiastic that it happened and that it be sustained. Well, all United Nations treaties have a new forum which the disability movement across the United States and the world can use to make rights real. Every treaty of the United States has a committee to monitor the states' parties' performance of their duties under the convention. In Japan, and there's some materials here that I think you'll find enormously interesting on the Japan's constitution and how it served the people with disabilities in Japan. In Japan, who early ratified the treaty, not only signed it, as did we, but who ratified the treaty, Japan has already had to do what every signed state party has to do, submit a report on the state of treaty implementation in its country, initially after 2 years, and thereafter under the disability treaty every 4 years. And all of the disability organizations, and indeed the bar associations, as in Japan, are entitled to comment on that report and to bring the facts as they know them to bear. And the committee on the monitoring of the treaty holds hearings, makes findings, announces those findings, and circulates them widely. Well, if marshaling a public to disability rights is the crucial undertaking, then that forum, just as the courts initially and the due process hearings that have happened across education and all of the hearings and demonstrations and the rest, that forum will help us bring to attention in the United States and across the world the importance of these rights and the importance of citizens making them real. Thank you very much.
Gene and I will stand, I think, because it's so hard to follow. I'm speechless. You know, I every time I listen to this guy, I learn something new. What a breadth of understanding of the meaning of rights in America. I just don't know anyone quite like Tom. He really has made a huge difference in our rights. So following that, Gene and I are going to talk about what happened here in Pennsylvania and how that contributed to the disability rights movement and how that feeds into the world movement now. What's going on is the most exciting time of my life because the whole world is trying to follow in what Tom just talked about. And in many ways, the movement of freedom on this earth is treasured here and is spreading, we hope. And in this way particularly. So that's what Gene and I are going to say. That's what we're going to talk about. Gene is going to talk about it from a human, individual, experiential point of view. And all these years, these 40 years, I've played scientist in the whole dance that we've been going through. I'm not a real scientist, but I play one.
A very real scientist.
Yeah, and after that introduction, I just wanted to say, after an intro like that, the only thing a person can do is quote Monty Python and say, I also wrote all of Shakespeare's sonnets. Okay, Gene helped.
No, not me, I'm sorry.
All right, like any jerk with a PowerPoint, I'm going to just move ahead. I want to start with a picture of a place called Pennhurst, which was finished in 1908 and it's not too far from here. It's near Spring City, Pennsylvania, and it's one of the 193 institutions that America had over these 150 years, and it became quite well known, partly because of efforts of Mr. Gilhul and colleagues, people like Gene, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. But the institutional model, the idea of taking people with disabilities and keeping them separate, that really began in the U.S. in about 1948, depending on how you count. A guy named Samuel Gridley Howe took a vacation in Germany, and he saw a segregated big place where they put all their folks with institutions, and came back and said, cool idea, let's do that. And the vision was they'd grow their own food, they'd be safe, protected from the pressures of normal life, and one of the first was the Massachusetts School for Idiotic Children, about 1848. Another of the first was right here, right nearby, the Elwyn Institute, also in 1848. There's a debate about which one was the first publicly funded institution for people with developmental disabilities. Terminology, what we used to call mental retardation, we now call intellectual and developmental disabilities, or just intellectual disabilities. What used to be the President's Committee on Mental Retardation is now the President's Committee on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Terminology, it keeps changing. Samuel Gridley Howe brought this idea to the U.S. in 1848, and by 1866 he said this: all such institutions are unnatural, undesirable, and very liable to abuse. So, mistake made, let's fix it. I goofed, sorry. He also said we should have as few of them as possible, and those few should be kept as small as possible. He also said, and this is the first statement I've ever seen of the principle of inclusion, such persons with disabilities should be kept diffused among sound and normal persons, meaning the worst thing we could do is separate those people, segregate them, and put them off in a place by themselves. That was 1866. So we're Americans, by golly, and what did we do? Well, we went on till about 1909. We had the White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, and there was a big fight in this conference, and it became dominated by those who wanted to end segregation, isolation of children in orphanages. And the orphanage concept was fought in 1909, and for the next 30 years, it really ended the period of large-scale orphanages, except for religious groups which still continue to promote orphanages for people in extreme need here and abroad. This is 1915 at that place I mentioned near here called Pennhurst. And I show that, and when I'm feeling lighthearted, I just marvel that how did they keep those kids sitting so still? They didn't have drugs. Everybody's sitting still. They had some form of control that just scares the heck out of me. But that is people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in 1915, children who have been put away in an institution far outside of Philadelphia, almost a day's ride by buggy. And when I went in 1970, this is what I saw. When I went, there were 2,800 people there, and they were mostly milling around, mostly naked, and mostly unengaged. The most horrible thing I've ever seen. So that's why Gene and I are working on this. Now, look at what we did after America's greatest expert said we should stop building institutions right about there. We put more and more citizens into public institutions right up until about 1970. We had almost 200,000 Americans in these segregated, isolated places in the U.S. And then I got out of college right about there and started working in this field, so you can see. Yeah. You know, I can get away with that when Tom's not here, but this time, this is not going to work at all. Well, there's a dramatic change in American support and treatment for people who are different beginning there. And this is, I was in college right during the height of the civil rights movement. I was involved in that. I was the first in the women's movement. I was the first jerk to teach women's liberation karate on the East Coast. 48 years later, I'm still teaching karate because that's how I learned to be peaceful.
You're not.
Evidently, I didn't read the manual. I found out, I first went to an institution right out of college, and I found out that in 1969, the average cost per person at Pennhurst, and this is true across the nation, was $5.90 per day to keep and feed and clothe a person at Pennhurst. And at the Philadelphia Zoo, a leopard was $7.15. Now, many years later, the issue of support for people in very big versus very small settings is kind of settled after 40 years of research and media scandals, court decisions. Institutions have declined and community options are preferred in every way. So in terms of American history, following what Tom said about the fundamentals of what it is to be an American and have rights, we've actually made some pretty huge changes. And I came in 1970, as I said, just out of college. And I had a degree in physiological psychology, a special interdisciplinary major in consciousness and brain research. Shut up, it was the 60s. And that's what I had to do. And I, of course, I got home, my mom said, what are you going to do with a degree in physiological psychology? I remember this distinctly when I said, and I quote, oh, you can do plenty, you can. How much did you pay for that college? So I went to the Maryland State Employment Office, got a strange job, working on a national survey of people with developmental disabilities. And I had learned a great deal about the human brain in my undergraduate education, and I thought, well, this fits. So I thought it was perfect. And it was right at the peak of institutionalization, 1970. And the first place I went, by pure random selection of facilities to go visit, just random choice, I went to this place called Pennhurst. There were 2,800 people there. It was designed for about 700. People were left in cribs all day and night, and I saw it. Broken bones were untreated, and I saw that. Problem people, if you bit somebody at Pennhurst once, you got punished. If you did it twice, generally you had all your teeth pulled out. All your teeth pulled out. So by the time Tom and his colleagues and I got to Pennhurst to gather evidence, about a third of the people there had no teeth. And about 2/3 of them were on toothbrushing programs because you gave the same program to everyone, no matter what. Isn't that, all of this is kind of stunning, but it was stunning to me. Bathing was often a hose sprayed at a group in a room with a drain in the floor, and I saw that. And I couldn't believe it. This was the richest country in the history of our species. And I drove home weeping. So, what happened was moving people out of that facility seemed like a terrifying idea. I was a skeptic, because when we moved people out of institutions, people with mental illness, it had been a disaster in America, because we never built community supports. We let people out of institutions, psychiatric hospitals, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We let people out of those places beginning in 1955. And they became homeless and went to prisons and nursing homes, because we never built the infrastructure in our communities to help them get jobs and places to live. We really never did that. We're doing it now, but back in the 60s and 70s, it was a disgrace. So I was afraid that this would be a disgrace too. So I wanted to do research on it, and I was lucky enough to get a job at Temple University, and we got a contract to do the study of what happened to the people at Pennhurst. After Mr. Gilhul and colleagues and the PARC, the ARC of Pennsylvania, which used to be called the Association for Retarded Children, and then the Association for Retarded Citizens, and now it's just the ARC. That organization, with this attorney, won a decision from a federal court to let everybody at Pennhurst have a chance at a real life and a real neighborhood. And this began in 1979 after the decision in '78. So I was really happy to be able to track every person, every one of those people, face to face, year after year, and this is still going on today. We still know where all those people are. It was the biggest study ever done. There were 1,154 people at Pennhurst on March 17th, 1978, when we started. We visited every person, we surveyed every family every year. We measured qualities of life, satisfaction, and costs, and it's still going on. Now I'm going to just tell you what we found, and then Jean's going to tell you what it was like to go through a life like that. Now, here's the good news. We've talked about rights, and we've talked about our history of segregating people. And remember, when I went to school, you can't remember, I'll remember. When I went to school, none of these people we're talking about were allowed in my school. The right to education didn't exist. People with significant disabilities didn't come to our schools at all. I never saw one. Never. Until I went to Pennhurst. And my son went to school with lots of folks with disabilities, and to him, it's no big deal. To me, it was terrifying and different and frightening. But the right to education actually began here in Pennsylvania because the Arc of Pennsylvania wanted to do something about Pennhurst. And the first thing Tom thought should be done, most people put people at Pennhurst because when they became teenagers, they got larger and more difficult to handle, and they couldn't be allowed in school. So people like me with PhDs and MDs, we tell parents, send them to Pennhurst. We built it just for you, and it's forever, and you can trust us. So they did. So years after all that, we now have the right to education, and people with disabilities are all over our culture and all over our society more than any other country. And I found in so many years of research that people at Pennhurst increased their independent functioning, they increased their control of their own behavior. The family resistance, which they initially had, changed overwhelmingly to support for movement to community homes. People themselves, those who could speak to us, and by the way, 2/3 of the people in this study and 2/3 of the people in institutions did not use traditional verbal language of any kind. Some could use language boards, some now use computers, but mostly these were people with disabilities so significant that language was not one of their skills. But those who could talk said, I'll never go back, I never want to go back. 14 qualities of life all went up, including happiness, inclusion, integration up off the scale. The amount of services went up, survival is up, mortality is down, and the costs were the same, actually a little lower, but that was because salaries in community settings were so much lower, and that really wasn't fair. But anyway, costs were the same or less. So we got better outcomes, longer lives at the same or lower cost. That's what you call a successful outcome. And this is a graph of the decline of institutions in America from 1950 to the present. And this is the rise of community programs. Now you've heard of group homes and family living programs where folks with disabilities live. Some of you, I bet you money, some of you have worked in a group home or something like that, or a workshop. Anybody? So it's kind of a fixture in the American landscape now. These things exist, they're everywhere, and people are no longer segregated the way they were. Now, Jean Searle is a member of the Pennhurst class because, well, I think Jean's going to explain. Now, do you want me to click or do you want to click?
You can click.
All right. I am at your service.
But you know what you're doing, I know.
All right. Jean, start with your parents, please.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Do I need a mic? Can you hear me?
If you turn around, we can see you, Gene.
Just look at my hat, that's all you need to see. All right, let me stand up and talk with the mic, I think it's better. Come over here. See what I'm doing. Tom, am I your way?
Nope. I'm in your way.
No, you're fine. My name is Jean Searle. As Jim said, I'm a Pennhurst class member. I had parents who were heavy drinkers and heavy smokers, and I am one of 7 children. And we were all, next, we all had some kind of a disability. I was in a foster care. I was in an institution from 12 to I was 19, and the institution was called Allied And, did you want to say something about this?
I do. Gene's one of the most courageous people I've ever known. Go ahead, blush. Because soon after we met around this Pennhurst situation, Gene said, I'd like to go back to that institution where I was raised. I've never known anybody who did that before, and invited me to go along, and that was guts. And going back to a place where you were mistreated and abused and isolated and really locked up.
It was my 25th anniversary coming out of the institution.
That was just something I will be always grateful for learning more about what it was like. But your courage is model.
Thank you. So I've been out since 1984, it'll be almost 30 years next year. And this is Allied Services. Now, the one thing that I miss, and I should have had this, is the first day that I went up there was, I was scared. I was like really scared to go back up there for the first time, because this woman right here, Janine, she was the first person that took me in, and she taught me the ropes, and she, trained me to do, what I need to do, and how to take care of a house, and where to live, and take care of a room and everything. So when I invited Jim to come up there with me, the one thing that we should have done is, when she came out of her office and I was coming out of the car, her and I just automatically hugged each other, and we just started crying. And that was just so moving. It was just like, wow. I had chills all over. It was like, oof.
And I couldn't get my camera to work.
No. So blame Jim for it. And this is Allied Services. This is what the institution looks like. Has anybody ever been to an institution or visited an institution? Besides you, Tom, and anybody else? What did you guys think? Did you guys, yeah?
I had been at Pennhurst. I had interviewed for a job at Pennhurst back in 76, 77, as a lifeguard. I went there. I wasn't hired, thank goodness, but I was like 18, 19, pretty amazing at that point. And then my mother worked at Hamburg, at a mental institution in Hamburg, which was a lot better. The institution care was a lot better. It wasn't great, but it was a lot better than what Pennhurst was. And those are my two experiences.
All right, next.
I'd like to add that you'll notice how integrated this facility is. It's right there in the community.
It's in a place where nowhere. It's like in the woods. And this is Allied Services. This is the bathroom. Now, this bathroom means a lot to me, because when the staff were on the corner doing whatever they wanted to do, the consumers, like me, we were hired to take care of the clients, to take them to the bathroom, to wipe their behind, to give them a shower, to put up the bed, make sure they ate, make sure they had their pajamas on. We were the ones that was taking care of the consumers. The staff people were downstairs, or they were in another corner, or they were doing something. So I was like the one in charge of the people that couldn't take care of themselves, which felt very uncomfortable to me, because I was there just to live there. I wasn't there just to take care of the consumers. That wasn't my job. My job was to learn from other people and not to wipe people's behind. So,
And there's very little privacy.
yes. Next. And this is the kids' dormitory at Allied Services. Now, can anybody find me in this picture besides you? And you don't say nothing. Can anybody find me that picture?
You're in the front?
No. Yeah? No. Nice try, no cigar. Jim, I said not to. You don't listen.
You ready?
You ready? Go ahead, Jim, point it out. Right there. What's nice, cutie patootie? And this is Janine Shoemaker and me right outside her office at Allied Services. This is not an institution, this is Stillmeadow, and I took Jim up here too. When we went to Stillmeadow, Jim never been to Stillmeadow, I think he heard about it, but he didn't know what it was. And we took one of my staff person with me that he was working with, and he never went to any institution before, except for the first time when he went to the institution. He was so surprised that he went to the institution. And this is the driveway into the institution. This right here is the building where I used to live in. Can I tell that story? The reason why I'm going like this is because the day that I was getting out of the institution, no one was allowed to go past where I'm standing. If you wanted to come in to visit anybody, you would have to go to the main building to sign in and say who you're going to see. Are you going to take them out? Are you going to drive, what are you going to do with them? And what do you have? Or, so they need to see everything. And so the day that I was going out of the institution, the cars were only allowed to park right there. They were not allowed to move any further than right where I was standing. Because if you did, you got in trouble. So you were just not allowed to do that. And my life after the institution, I got out in '84 out of Stillmeadow. I went to a community group home and a workshop. I have an apartment, a job, many other jobs, and many homes. 19 years at the Disability Rights Network and a new apartment. Member of 7 or 8 boards.
Because we're losing count.
We are losing count. Jim, this is you, Jim.
So after that early life, Gene's now on the Developmental Disabilities Council, the ARC of Pennsylvania, and on and on and on. We can hardly keep track of the boards Gene's on now. That's some kind of success story. And I'll just take a minute myself to say, a lot of people think that if you move people with significant disabilities out of institutions, that it's going to cost a lot. But we found in our research that people with the most severe labels, like profound mental retardation, they didn't really cost any more than people with the mild and moderate labels. So that was a myth. You cost a ton of money. And the size of home, the smaller the home tends to have lower costs. The larger homes over here on the right tend to cost a lot. So now, public institutions, and there's about 35,000 Americans still in public institutions like these, and they run an average of about $230,000 per person per year. It's the most expensive human service in the history of our species.
But we're putting people back in, too.
And Pennsylvania recently put a few people back into line. We still have about 1,100 people in 5 institutions in Pennsylvania. I'm going to skip the economy of scale. I just want to say smaller homes and smaller places of work and recreation seem to be better for human beings. And I'll refer my friends here in the room to this book, Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Matter. It sounds like a hippie joke, but actually it was written by one of the heads of the London School of Economics, and he's a very serious econometrician. And this is a really cool book, and it's very, very relevant right now. Economics as if people mattered in the era of the greatest income inequality that we've ever had in the United States, more so than the late 1920s. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really began in 2002. It was introduced by Mexico and strongly supported by New Zealand. It was adopted by the General Assembly in December 2006, opened for signatures in March 2007, went into effect in 2008. We now have 158 countries that have signed it, 134 have ratified it, and the U.S. signed in 2008 as soon as we got a new president, but we have failed to ratify. The U.S. Senate has to ratify by a 2/3 majority any international treaty. So we're still waiting on that. But Article 19 of the Convention says, and this is from Wikipedia's simple version, and which actually says it pretty well, living by oneself and being accepted in society, countries must admit that persons with disabilities have rights to take part in society and not to be isolated and segregated from society. We have 158 countries that have signed that statement. This is magnificent. That's the full text, but I'll skip it. And I want to say that after all this 40 years of research, and my little group, nonprofit group that I run, has followed more than 7,000 people out of institutions. And I would say this has been the most successful social experiment of my generation in America. We did a lot of good things in many generations, and this is the one that I would tout as the biggest success. We got people out of segregated, isolated, abusive institutions, and they're doing extremely well all over America. And now the entire rest of the world is asking America, how did you do that? And can we learn from you? And that's why now I've been to Israel and Latvia and Finland last February for 10 days. And all the countries of the world want to know, what have you done for folks with disabilities? And all over the planet now, we're making a difference. So I'm closing with, I'll do the left-hand side, you do the right-hand side. I grew up with parents, good parents in suburbs. I had the best schools, got into Yale, God knows how. I was offered jobs that were interesting and fun. I got a PhD for free while I was working at Temple University, very cool. 20 years I've run my own company, almost into the ground. Invited to serve on several boards, and now I'm the co-president of Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance. Did I pull myself up by my bootstraps? No. I was given every gift a person could have from the get-go. In contrast,
Me, I grew up in a foster home and institution, no chance for college, spent a group home and workshop, moved off from a group home to my own home, 18 years employed, structured to serve on 6 major boards. I'm a member of the PMPA, co-president.
same as me.
Same as Jim. Bootstraps, you bet.
So we wound up at the same place, but which story is more inspiring to you? For me. And to give an international perspective, this quote from Winston Churchill, people really love this quote in other countries. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing. After they've tried it. Thanks.
What a fascinating presentation. We have just a few minutes left. I want to give the audience a chance to ask any questions they might have of any of our panelists. Who'd like to go first? While you're thinking of your question, and when I'm giving an assignment to students to go to a lecture, I always tell them they either have to ask a question or write a paper. So I pass that on to the academics. It certainly does get the questions going. So if anybody's here from me, that's the rule. But anyway, I have a question. 35,000 people in institutions now. and it seems to, it's flat, you know, as I watch the charts, that's not changing very much. What's it gonna take? I mean, is that the reality? Is that the future? Or what needs to happen for there to be no people living in institutions? Or is there some number of people for whom an institutional life is the best that they can hope for? And I think I know the answer to that last question, but I'll pose it anyway.
I'll share this with my colleagues, but first, there's 14 states now that have nobody in one of these institutions. 14. We're about to get a 15th. I was just there, Oklahoma. So we're moving in that direction, and it's going to happen probably in my lifetime. We'll probably not have these places anymore. What keeps them open? Because 40, 50 years ago, people like me told parents, we promise this is the best thing and it's forever. So those parents are still hanging on to that belief. It's the best thing and it's forever. And it's so hard for, you know, people like me with degrees to come along and say, oh, how could you put your son in an institution? It's a terrible place. Who would trust us? We're known liars. So the families and some of the people themselves really don't want this change.
The future depends on who we elect governor, who we elect to the legislators and legislature, and all of that is in your hands, and it needs attention. Question, Becky.
I just had a question about that. Can you give me a description of your job again? You're the co-president of Pennhurst, right? Is that what it?
Job description?
Yeah, like
Pennhurst Alliance.
Oh, well, the job description is this. I do all the work and Gene takes all the credit. Oh my God, I am so doomed.
But you
were so
work
smart.
at one of the institutions.
Can you
No.
explain the alliance to us?
Yes, tell what it's all about.
What we do is we have a board meeting every month, and we talk about certain issues that we want to accomplish. So the one thing that we're working on right now is we're getting ready to finish up a book about Pennhurst. So we're getting ready to have a Pennhurst book that's going to come out maybe next year, I think.
Maybe. Dr. Downey.
Dr. Downey next year. Should I count on that?
We're always hopeful, yes.
Yeah. So, and then I run every board meeting. He don't run nothing. He just sits in the corner, look pretty.
I take notes.
He does take notes. And what we also do is we want to accomplish a couple of things. The one thing we want to accomplish is that we want to have a traveling museum. So we want to travel around the state to tell people about Pennhurst and what we used to do with people who used to live there and you know, the people that was there. Has anybody been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? So you guys, it's almost like that, but when I first went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I only wanted to see one thing. The one thing was, I wanted to know how people with disabilities was being treated. And the way that, and what I found out was, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't all peaches and cream. It was more like being abused, like you were in prison. And it's like, you know, you have to do stuff, and you know, you're constantly on the move all the time. So that's sort of what we do. We travel around the state all the time and tell our story about Pennhurst, and you know. What question?
Got it?
Got it.
We want to do a traveling exhibit and maybe someday a museum. The real long-term goal is someday, you know how there's an African-American museum and a museum of the American Indian? Someday there will be a disability memorial museum, so that we'll never forget what we did for 150 years. That's the big goal. And I want to say loudly and to all of you here that the book, our first goal is to finish this book, to get the story out there, because what happened in the disability rights movement was largely keyed on what happened right here in Pennsylvania. So we want to finish that book, and the idea for the book and the editor is right in the back of the room, Dr. Dennis Downey. So thank you.
My question for you is that this whole movement started, and like you said, the integration now of, you know, the generations now see no problem being integrated with students with disabilities. With the cuts that have happened in public budget lately, is it bothering you that, you know, I went to public school, I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was younger, so I know that, you know, it's a lot of help and it's a lot of money. And my schools around me, actually the high school I went to, just cut their special ed program significantly because of, you know, the budget issues. So my question is that you did all of this work. Is there anything we could do maybe to stop this from happening?
Tom's getting ready, and that's the man. That's the man to answer your question. Just let me say, it's a myth that special ed is so much more expensive than regular.
Yeah.
It is only more expensive when we segregate the kids. When they're integrated, it's not more expensive. So that's just a myth, and it makes me furious.
There is a huge amount which you can do. the ve- What?
You're good, go ahead, sorry.
The fact that you raised the question indicates that you are driven to do something. All across the country, you can identify those states who have cut food stamps, public assistance, everything else, and most of all, education. We happen to live in one of those states. We have a very important election coming up. The House and Senate in Harrisburg are controlled by Republicans. There are 3 or 4 of them that I know and you may know who are really human rights people, who care about people. As Thaddeus Stevens said, it's really the most rewarding of human experiences to care about people. But in this age, for some curious reason, it's not as widespread as it should be. And it really is in your hands. There must be 4 or 5 districts in the state House of Representatives within reach of where you sleep every night. There must be 2 or 3 state Senate districts within reach. And there is a governor who must be in a primary next spring and a general election the following fall. And I could repeat that tale about so many other states for those of you who have come from other places. It's crucial. It's crucial. And I just wanted to tell you that if you think this is a new challenge, let me refer you to Thaddeus Stevens' speech on June the 28th, 1834. He had just been elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives from Gettysburg. The year before, a governor of the opposite party from Thad had passed the first Free Schools Act statewide in the nation. Actually, several years before Horace Mann did it in Massachusetts. First, Thaddeus Stevens got to the House of Representatives and found a few weeks in that the Senate had voted to repeal the Free Schools Act of 1834. So he prepared to do a speech, and this is it. And historians call it the most effective legislative speech of the 19th century. After he finished, the Senate filed back into their chamber and repealed their repealer. And the arguments he was dealing with are exactly the arguments that are invoked for the current round of austerity, of self-harming behavior, which too many leaders of our polity are engaged in. So I commend to you that speech of one of your brothers who walked the ground in which this campus has risen. And you may find some armamentarium to use there in the battles that are immediately ahead for all of us.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that the institutions around today hold a lot of mental health consumers, and my daughter's alive today because of a state hospital where she will most likely reside for the rest of her life, and she will be alive. So I just want to point out to the students here that we have our daughter because of the state system, and we're grateful for that. So, and she's gotten the best treatment that she's ever gotten. It costs $300 to treat her in the state hospital, and we've been through programs where it was $2,000 a day to treat her out of state. So there is a place for the state hospitals, in my opinion and in my experience.
What is the name of the place that you're going?
Warnersville State Hospital.
Wernersville. We were always very careful, my colleagues at the Law Center, to understand that the state of the art in mental illness and the state of the art in retardation were very different things. And there are people who make the case that you make for people with very severe mental illness. There are people who also point out how very effective and perhaps similar services could be delivered in the community. It's worth looking at both sides of that state of the art. This state of the art is so well established. Jim, in how many states did you do the follow-up studies?
Depending on how you count the follow-up, it's 13.
I must tell you that it was very important to the growth of community services around the country from 1979 on that judges who had the matter in front of them, cases just like Pennhurst, and there were 33 of them within a few years of the Pennhurst decisions in 1978, eve of Christmas. Judge Broderick always liked, he issued his orders on the eve of St. Patrick's Day. He always liked to issue orders because he didn't appreciate the treatment the press had given him in the gubernatorial election of 1971, which he lost. Thank God for that, because he instead rose to the federal bench. In any event, he would always issue his opinions on the eve of a holiday to keep the press hard at work. In any event, the other judges around the country and many legislators would not have acted in this tradition for these purposes unless they understood that the fact was well established, that it could be done, and it could be done well. So the science, in ways that will not surprise you generally, was very important to the actual implementation of rights and to the orders that they be provided to people.
Well, we started on time, and I know there's a lot more to talk about, and I'm sure the presenters will talk to you, but we're going to end on time. There's a coffee break to follow and other sessions, so thank you all for coming, and thank you for a very...
Thank you.